16-year-old Logan Cooper walked into the crowded cafeteria of Ocean View High School in San Diego, California, and brutally stabbed 2 students to death during the busy lunch period. His victims, Donna Hargrove, 17, and Ryan Wilson, 16, were each stabbed multiple times in the head and chest before school security officers could subdue the attacker. Medical responders pronounced both victims dead at the scene, their bodies crumpled beside cafeteria tables where, moments earlier, they had been laughing with friends. The weapon, a hunting knife with a 6-inch serrated blade, was found still clutched in Logan's hand when officers arrived, the teenager making no attempt to flee or resist arrest. If you're watching this video, please hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing these in-depth true crime stories to light. The attack unfolded with a calculated precision that would later shock investigators and contradict the typical chaos of school violence incidents. Security camera footage showed Logan entering the cafeteria at exactly 12:15 p.m. when the room was at maximum capacity and moving directly toward his targets without hesitation or apparent emotion. Witnesses described how he approached Donna first, stabbing her from behind as she stood in the lunch line before turning to Ryan, who was seated at a nearby table. The entire incident lasted less than 45 seconds, but transformed the sun-drenched Southern California high school from a place of learning into a crime scene. The screams of hundreds of terrified teenagers echoed through Ocean View High's corridors as students fled or froze in horror, their typical lunch period transformed into a waking nightmare. The immediate response from school security prevented additional casualties, as 2 officers tackled Logan to the ground less than a minute after the first stab wound was inflicted. Officer Raymond Diaz, a retired San Diego police officer who had taken the school security position just 8 months earlier, would later tell reporters that the look in Logan's eyes was completely vacant, like he wasn't even there. Blood had splattered across the cafeteria's white tile floor, creating crimson patterns that stretched nearly 20 feet from where the attacks took place. Parents received emergency text alerts and began arriving at the school within minutes, creating a chaotic scene in the parking lot as police established a perimeter and medical examiners prepared to process the crime scene. The sunny San Diego day, with its perfect 72-degree temperature and cloudless sky, stood in stark contrast to the darkness that had descended upon Ocean View High School. The school was immediately placed on lockdown, with students huddled in classrooms for nearly 3 hours as SWAT teams conducted a thorough sweep of the campus. Though Logan had acted alone, initial reports of multiple attackers had triggered the comprehensive response from law enforcement across San Diego County. Helicopter footage broadcast on local news showed hundreds of traumatized teenagers being escorted from the building with hands raised, many still in tears or visible shock. Ocean View High School, known for its Spanish-style architecture with terracotta roof tiles and open-air courtyards, had been designed to embrace San Diego's perfect weather and laid-back coastal lifestyle. That open, welcoming design, with its multiple entry points and expansive common areas, would later be scrutinized as police reviewed how Logan had executed his attack with such deadly efficiency. Principal Diana Mendez, who had been at a district meeting when the attack occurred, returned to find her school transformed into a mess of police tape, emergency vehicles, and sobbing families. The cafeteria, a point of pride for the school with its recently renovated facilities and healthy food options, had become the epicenter of the tragedy. Blood-stained lunch trays lay overturned on the floor, abandoned backpacks were scattered throughout the space, and personal items like cell phones and notebooks created a trail showing the panicked evacuation. 2 bodies covered with white sheets remained where they had fallen until crime scene technicians could complete their work. The sunlight streaming through the cafeteria's large windows created an almost surreal atmosphere, illuminating the scene in a harsh brightness that seemed to amplify rather than diminish the horror of what had occurred in this beachside community, where violent crime rates were among the lowest in Southern California. News of the stabbing spread through San Diego's normally tranquil coastal communities with shocking speed. Parents who had dropped their children off that morning at what was considered one of the city's premier public high schools now gathered in terrified clusters at the designated reunification point in a nearby church parking lot. The school's proximity to the Pacific Ocean meant that the scent of salt water mingled with the metallic smell of blood as crime scene technicians worked inside the building. Local businesses closed early as a show of respect, and the city's famous beaches, usually packed with tourists and locals enjoying the perfect weather, were unusually quiet that afternoon. San Diego Mayor Frank Reynolds appeared at a hastily organized press conference, his voice breaking as he described the attack as an unspeakable tragedy that has shattered our community's sense of safety and innocence. Logan Cooper was transported from the scene in a police cruiser, his blood-stained clothes preserved as evidence, and his demeanor described by officers as eerily calm. The teenager, who would later be charged as an adult despite being only 16 years old, made no statements to arresting officers beyond asking if he would still be able to take his history test scheduled for that afternoon. This apparent disconnect from the gravity of his actions would become a focal point for both prosecution and defense in the months to come. The knife he had used in the attack had been purchased legally by his father 2 years earlier for camping trips, though Logan had modified the handle for a better grip, another detail that would later support the prosecution's case for premeditation. As the sun set over San Diego that evening, the city known for its perfect weather and relaxed lifestyle found itself at the center of a national conversation about school violence, mental health, and the hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface of even the most idyllic communities. Donna Hargrove was more than just a victim. She was a 17-year-old honor student with dreams that would never be realized, her potential forever frozen on that March afternoon. The eldest daughter of Mexican immigrants who had worked their way into San Diego's middle class through decades of determination, Donna had already been accepted to 3 prestigious universities on pre-med scholarships. Her bedroom walls, painted a cheerful yellow that captured the essence of San Diego's perpetual sunshine, were covered with acceptance letters, scientific diagrams, and a meticulously organized study schedule that would now never be completed. Every teacher described Donna as exceptional, not just academically, where she maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA, but in her genuine desire to use her talents to improve the lives of others. Ryan Wilson, the second victim, had just received news of a baseball scholarship to UCLA 1 week before his death, a culmination of years of early morning practices on San Diego's dew-covered fields. At 16, the athletic teenager with an easy smile had already overcome significant challenges, including his parents' difficult divorce 3 years earlier, and a shoulder injury that had threatened his athletic career before intensive physical therapy helped him recover. His coaches described him as a natural leader who made a point of mentoring younger players and volunteering with adaptive sports programs for children with disabilities. Ryan's bedroom remained untouched for months after his death, his baseball trophies gathering dust, and his UCLA acceptance package still sealed on his desk, a future denied by the blade of a hunting knife wielded by a classmate he barely knew. The lives of these 2 teenagers intersected only briefly. They shared just one class and had few mutual friends, but they were forever linked in death by a random act of violence that had nothing to do with who they were as individuals. Neither Donna nor Ryan had participated in bullying Logan Cooper. In fact, several classmates later testified that Donna had once offered to share her lunch with Logan after witnessing him being teased. Ryan, absorbed in his athletic pursuits and academic responsibilities, had little interaction with Logan beyond occasionally nodding hello in the hallways. Their selection as victims appeared to be based not on personal grudges, but on their physical locations in the cafeteria when Logan decided to execute his plan, a horrifying reminder of the random nature of their deaths. The Hargrove family's small but immaculate home in a working-class San Diego neighborhood became a gathering place for mourners in the days after the attack, with Donna's mother Maria unable to enter her daughter's bedroom for weeks. The kitchen table where Donna had studied late into the night was transformed into a memorial covered with photographs, candles, and the acceptance letter from Stanford University, where she had planned to begin pre-med studies that fall. Donna's younger siblings, Carlos, 14, and Elena, 11, struggled to understand why their brilliant older sister, who had read them bedtime stories and helped with homework, would never return home. The family's Catholic faith provided some comfort, but Maria Hargrove would later testify that she still set a place for Donna at the dinner table for months after her death, unable to accept that her daughter was gone. The Wilson home, located in a more affluent neighborhood closer to San Diego's coastline, became similarly transformed by grief. Ryan's father, an insurance executive, took a leave of absence that would stretch into years, while his mother channeled her anguish into creating a foundation promoting conflict resolution in schools. The baseball field where Ryan had played since childhood was renamed in his honor, with a bronze plaque detailing his athletic achievements and quoting his personal motto, "Work hard, stay humble, lift others." His golden retriever, Scout, would wait by the front door every afternoon at the time Ryan would normally return from practice, a heartbreaking ritual that continued for months. Ryan's girlfriend of 2 years, Amber Chen, was hospitalized briefly for shock after learning of his death and would later become an outspoken advocate for school safety reforms. Both families attended every day of Logan Cooper's trial, seated on opposite sides of the courtroom, but united in their grief and determination to see justice served. The Hargroves, with their limited English and unfamiliarity with the American legal system, relied heavily on victim advocates to guide them through the complex proceedings. The Wilsons, more versed in legal matters, took extensive notes throughout the trial and consulted regularly with the prosecution team. Despite these differences, the two families formed an unexpected bond, occasionally sharing meals during court recesses and supporting each other through particularly difficult testimony. Donna's mother and Ryan's father were often seen embracing outside the courthouse, their shared loss transcending differences in background, culture, and socioeconomic status. The community's response to the deaths reflected San Diego's dual nature, both the tight-knit, compassionate aspects of its residents and the socioeconomic divisions that characterize the coastal California city. A memorial service held on Ocean View Beach drew over 2,000 attendees from across the county, with the Pacific Ocean providing a solemn backdrop as speakers celebrated the lives of the two teenagers. Local businesses donated tens of thousands of dollars to scholarship funds established in Donna's and Ryan's names, while muralists created tributes on walls throughout the city. Yet beneath this united front of mourning, tensions simmered regarding school safety, bullying prevention, and whether warning signs had been missed. Some parents from wealthier neighborhoods transferred their children to private schools, while those without such resources demanded better security and mental health services in the public education system. The media coverage of Donna and Ryan's lives and deaths reflected the nation's fascination with tragedy, but also raised uncomfortable questions about how victims are portrayed. National news outlets emphasized Donna's academic achievements and immigrant success story, while Ryan's athletic prowess and all-American good looks made him an equally compelling figure for public sympathy. Photos of the two teenagers, Donna in her debate team blazer and Ryan in his baseball uniform, became iconic images replayed on news channels across the country. Yet some commentators noted that had the victims been less photogenic or accomplished, had they come from more troubled backgrounds or struggled academically, their deaths might not have captured the same level of public attention. This uncomfortable truth sparked discussions about which victim society deems worthy of outrage and mourning. The loss of Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson created ripple effects throughout San Diego that would be felt for years to come. Ocean View High School experienced a significant drop in enrollment the following academic year, with many parents citing safety concerns despite enhanced security measures. The city's previously relaxed attitude toward public spaces became more cautious, with increased security visible at schools, parks, and community events. Mental health resources for teenagers were expanded across the county, with new screening programs implemented to identify at-risk youth. The Hargrove and Wilson families established a joint foundation dedicated to preventing school violence. Their shared grief transformed into a mission to ensure that other parents would be spared the anguish they had endured. 2 empty chairs remained permanently in Ocean View High's graduation ceremonies, adorned with caps and gowns for the students who would never have the chance to wear them. The 911 call came in at precisely 12:17 p.m., a teenage girl's voice breaking with terror as she reported, "Someone's stabbing people in the cafeteria at Ocean View High." Dispatcher Melissa Ortega maintained remarkable composure as she extracted crucial details from the panicked caller while simultaneously dispatching multiple units to the school located in San Diego's northern coastal district. The first responders arrived within 4 minutes to find the school's security officers had already subdued the suspect, but nothing could prepare the veteran officers for the bloody scene that awaited them in the normally cheerful cafeteria, with its ocean-themed murals and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking carefully manicured grounds. 2 students lay motionless in spreading pools of blood that stark against the cafeteria's white tile floor, while dozens of traumatized teenagers were either huddled in corners or being ushered to safety by staff members. Detective Gabriel Johnson, a 15-year veteran of the San Diego Police Department's Violent Crimes Unit, arrived on scene at 12:32 p.m. and immediately established a command post in the school's administrative offices. Johnson, known for his methodical approach and specialization in crimes involving juvenile offenders, recognized that the first hours of the investigation would be critical in preserving evidence and gathering witness statements before memories could be contaminated by discussion or media reports. The detective ordered the entire campus sealed, with all students and staff kept separated in classrooms where they could be interviewed individually, a massive undertaking that would require officers from multiple precincts across San Diego County. As medical examiners confirmed what was already apparent, that Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson had died at the scene from multiple stab wounds, Johnson turned his attention to the suspect, 16-year-old Logan Cooper, who sat handcuffed in the school security office, still covered in his victim's blood, but displaying an unsettling calm. The crime scene processing began immediately, with technicians photographing and documenting every detail of the cafeteria before anything could be disturbed. Blood spatter analysis would later confirm that Donna had been attacked first, with arterial spray patterns showing that she had been stabbed from behind while standing in the lunch line, likely unaware of her attacker until the first blow struck. Ryan's wounds indicated he had turned to face his attacker, with defensive cuts on his hands and forearms showing he had attempted to shield himself from the onslaught. The murder weapon, a Ka-Bar hunting knife with a 7-inch blade, remained at the scene, having been secured by security officer Raymond Diaz, who had tackled Logan to the ground. Most crucial to the investigation, however, was the discovery made when officers searched Logan's backpack, which had been dropped near the cafeteria entrance. a spiral-bound notebook containing detailed plans for the attack, including a hand-drawn map of the cafeteria with notations about optimal entry points, crowd density at different lunch periods, and escape routes. As crime scene technicians continued their work, Detective Johnson conducted a preliminary interview with school security officer Raymond Diaz, who provided the first critical clue beyond the physical evidence. "The kid was asking weird questions last week," Diaz recalled, explaining that he had overheard Logan asking another student which classrooms had windows that didn't open. Diaz admitted he hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was related to a science project or perhaps a complaint about ventilation, but had mentioned it to English teacher Andrea Winters, who had reportedly heard the same question. This seemingly innocuous detail immediately caught Johnson's attention, as it suggested premeditation and possible planning of either attack or escape routes, information that would prove invaluable both for the investigation and eventual prosecution. The detective immediately requested that Officer Andrea Winters be located and brought to the command post for questioning, while simultaneously dispatching officers to secure Logan Cooper's home before any evidence could be removed or destroyed. San Diego's predictably perfect weather, normally a blessing for the coastal community, created challenges for the crime scene technicians as the afternoon heat increased the rate of blood degradation at the scene, forcing them to work with additional urgency. Johnson, mindful of the media helicopters already circling overhead and the crowd of parents and reporters gathering beyond the police perimeter, ordered the victims' bodies removed via a side entrance to avoid sensationalistic coverage. The detective's experience with high-profile cases had taught him that maintaining the dignity of victims was not only the right ethical choice, but also important for maintaining the community's trust during what would inevitably be a highly publicized investigation. Ms. Andrea Winters arrived at the command post, visibly shaken, but determined to provide whatever assistance she could to the investigation. The English teacher, who had taught at Ocean View High for 11 years, confirmed that she had indeed overheard Logan Cooper asking another student about windows that didn't open, specifying that this had occurred just 3 days before the attack. "He was very specific," Winters recalled, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "He wanted to know which classrooms had windows that were permanently sealed and which ones could be opened in an emergency." The teacher admitted with visible remorse that she hadn't reported the conversation because it had seemed innocuous at the time, though in retrospect she recognized it as part of Logan's methodical planning. This testimony provided Detective Johnson with what would become the foundational clue in the case, establishing clear premeditation and directly contradicting any potential claims that the attack had been impulsive or triggered by an immediate provocation. While the teacher was being interviewed, another team of detectives had secured Logan Cooper's home, a modest single-story residence in a middle-class neighborhood about 2 miles from the school. Logan's parents, both at work when the attack occurred, arrived home to find their residence transformed into an active crime scene, with officers already executing a search warrant. Thomas Cooper, a construction foreman, and his wife Linda, an administrative assistant at a local medical office, appeared genuinely shocked by their son's actions, repeatedly telling officers there must be some mistake. The search of Logan's bedroom, however, yielded additional evidence of planning, including Internet search histories related to knife attacks, human anatomy with specific focus on vital organs, and school shooting cases. Most damning was a journal hidden beneath Logan's mattress containing detailed entries about the daily humiliation he had endured in the school cafeteria over the past 2 years, culminating in a chilling entry dated just 1 week before the attack. "The cafeteria has been their stadium, and I've been their entertainment for too long. Soon it will be my hunting ground." As evening fell over San Diego, bringing with it a spectacular sunset that seemed perversely beautiful given the day's events, Detective Johnson coordinated the processing of over 60 witness statements collected from students and staff. Several accounts specifically mentioned Logan Cooper's history as a victim of bullying, particularly during lunch periods, with multiple students describing incidents of food being thrown at him, trays being knocked over, and organized chants mocking his weight. One witness statement, provided by a cafeteria worker, mentioned seeing Logan eating lunch in bathroom stalls on multiple occasions, apparently to avoid the harassment he faced in the public eating area. These testimonies began to establish a possible motive, though Johnson was careful to note in his preliminary report that while bullying might explain Logan's targeting of the cafeteria as a location, it did not appear that his specific victims had participated in his harassment, suggesting a more generalized rage rather than targeted revenge. By 9 p.m., the initial phase of the investigation had yielded substantial evidence, all pointing to a carefully planned attack motivated by long-term psychological trauma rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Detective Johnson, reviewing the day's findings in the temporary incident command center established in the school's library, focused particularly on the foundational clue of Logan's question about windows that wouldn't open. When combined with the maps and notes found in his possession, this detail revealed a level of premeditation that would prove crucial in determining how the case would be charged and tried. The detective authorized the release of minimal information to the press, confirming only the identities of the deceased after ensuring their families had been properly notified, and the fact that a juvenile suspect was in custody. Johnson knew from experience that the coming days would bring intense scrutiny from media, politicians, and a traumatized community searching for answers about how such violence could erupt in their sun-drenched, seemingly idyllic coastal city. The night brought no rest for the investigation team as forensic analysis of the digital evidence seized from Logan's home began to reveal a disturbing timeline of escalating thoughts and plans. The teenager's online activities showed increasing research into methods of violence, with particular focus on knife attacks and their lethality when directed at specific body areas. Social media forensics revealed that while Logan maintained accounts on several platforms, his activity was minimal, and he appeared to have few online connections, a digital isolation that mirrored his social status at school. Particularly notable was a series of searches about security measures at schools similar to Ocean View High, including questions about response times for emergency services in San Diego's northern neighborhoods. These digital breadcrumbs, when combined with the physical evidence and witness testimonies, painted a picture of a methodically planned attack by a socially isolated teenager who had transformed from bullying victim to perpetrator of extreme violence. As the initial shock of the stabbings began to give way to the methodical process of investigation, Detective Gabriel Johnson focused his attention on developing a comprehensive profile of Logan Cooper, the quiet sophomore who had transformed from an ordinary student to a killer in the span of 45 seconds. Logan's academic records, obtained through a court order the morning after the attack, revealed a student of above-average intelligence whose performance had noticeably declined over the previous 18 months. His freshman year grades showed mostly A's and B's, but by the middle of his sophomore year, he was failing 3 classes and had accumulated numerous absences, particularly in the periods following lunch. School counselor Diane Rodriguez confirmed that Logan had been referred to her office twice for these academic issues, but the scheduled sessions had been brief and unproductive, with Logan displaying what she described as minimal engagement and reluctance to discuss any personal problems. The foundational clue, Logan's question about windows that wouldn't open, became the central focus of the investigation's second day. Detective Johnson conducted a more in-depth interview with English teacher Andrea Winters, who provided crucial additional context that strengthened the evidence of premeditation. It wasn't just a casual question, Ms. Winters explained in her recorded statement at police headquarters, the ocean visible through the windows of the interview room providing a serene backdrop to her troubling testimony. Logan approached another student, Jason Chen, who was working on the school newspaper, and specifically asked which classrooms had windows that couldn't be opened from the inside. The teacher recalled that Logan had claimed the information was for an article about fire safety, but in retrospect, she recognized this as a cover story for what was actually reconnaissance for his attack. When Johnson asked why this hadn't seemed suspicious at the time, Winters looked down at her hands and replied, "In San Diego, we don't think about school shootings or stabbings. We worry about earthquakes and wildfires, not violence." Jason Chen, the student newspaper editor who had been questioned by Logan, provided additional details that further illuminated the significance of this foundational clue. In his statement, recorded with his parents present, due to his minor status, Jason described how Logan had approached him with unusual intensity, claiming to be writing an article about emergency evacuation procedures. He wanted to know which classrooms would be death traps in a fire because their windows didn't open, Jason stated, the irony of the phrasing not lost on Detective Johnson. The young journalist had provided Logan with the information, even showing him the school's floor plan that was kept in the newspaper office for reference, never suspecting the true purpose behind the questions. Jason's statement corroborated Ms. Winters' account and added the critical detail that Logan had been particularly interested in classrooms near the cafeteria, suggesting he may have been planning potential escape routes or possibly additional attack locations. Armed with these testimonies, Detective Johnson obtained a more comprehensive search warrant for Logan's digital devices, including a laptop computer and smartphone recovered from his bedroom. The digital forensics team worked through the night, recovering deleted search histories and files that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of a methodically planned attack. Logan had researched not just which areas of the human body were most vulnerable to knife attacks, but specifically how to ensure fatality with minimal effort, focusing on the head and heart, precisely where his victims had been stabbed. He had studied the layout of Ocean View High School extensively, with particular attention to security camera placements, staff patrol patterns during lunch periods, and, most tellingly, which areas of the school had windows that could or could not be opened from the inside, information that matched his questioning of Jason Chen and that had been overheard by Ms. Winters. The digital evidence also provided the first clear window into Logan's motive, with recovered diary entries and private social media messages revealing the extent of the bullying he had endured. Day 347 of Cafeteria Hell read one entry dated 3 months before the attack, followed by a detailed description of having his lunch tray knocked to the floor and being subjected to organized chants about his weight that had apparently become a regular feature of his school day. Photos recovered from Logan's phone showed lunches eaten in bathroom stalls, the stained floor visible beneath his feet, with timestamps indicating this had been his routine for much of the past 2 years. Most chilling was a video Logan had secretly recorded 6 weeks before the attack, showing a group of students throwing food at him while cafeteria staff visibly turned away, pretending not to notice. The file name of this video? Evidence. They deserve it. Sent a chill through even the experienced detectives reviewing the material. Meanwhile, interviews with Logan's parents revealed a home life that, while not abusive, was characterized by emotional distance and parental preoccupation with financial struggles. Thomas and Linda Cooper described their son as increasingly withdrawn over the past 2 years, but attributed this to typical teenage behavior rather than a warning sign. "We asked if everything was okay at school," Linda Cooper stated through tears during her interview, the San Diego sunlight casting harsh shadows across her face in the police station's interview room. "He always said fine. Everything was fine." The Coopers confirmed they owned several hunting knives, including the murder weapon, which had been kept in a display case that was not locked, a common practice in their neighborhood where many families participated in outdoor activities. Neither parent had noticed the knife's disappearance, nor had they observed any concerning behaviors in their son beyond his increasing tendency to isolate himself in his bedroom. By the third day of the investigation, a clear picture of Logan Cooper had emerged, a socially isolated teenager who had endured systematic bullying centered around the school cafeteria, who had methodically planned an attack focused on that specific location, and who had carefully researched both his method and potential escape routes. The foundational clue, his question about windows that wouldn't open, had led investigators to uncover a level of premeditation that would prove crucial in the prosecution's eventual decision to charge him as an adult despite his age. Detective Johnson, reviewing the evidence in his office overlooking San Diego's harbor, noted in his case summary that Logan appeared to have selected the cafeteria specifically because it was where his humiliation had occurred, but that his victims seemed to have been chosen based on opportunity rather than specific grudges, a detail that made the crime in some ways more disturbing, as it suggested a generalized rage rather than targeted revenge. Interviews with Logan's classmates painted a complex picture that neither fully excused nor entirely condemned the young suspect. Many students confirmed witnessing the bullying Logan had endured, with several expressing remorse for not having intervened. "Everyone saw it happening," admitted basketball team captain Marcus Williams in his statement. "We just thought it was normal cafeteria stuff, you know? Nobody thought it would lead to this." Other students described Logan as weird or creepy, citing his tendency to stare without speaking and his habit of writing constantly in notebooks that he never shared. A small group of students who had occasionally interacted with Logan in class projects described him as intelligent but socially awkward, with one girl noting that he never knew how to take a joke, everything was always super serious with him. None, however, had anticipated violence, with the consistent refrain being some variation of, "I never thought he would do something like this." The investigation expanded to include Logan's online presence, revealing a digital life almost as isolated as his physical one. Unlike many teenagers in technology-saturated Southern California, Logan maintained minimal social media profiles with few connections and little activity. His online footprint consisted primarily of passive consumption rather than interaction, with extensive viewing of survivalist forums, true crime content, and, most concerning, sites dedicated to documenting school violence. Digital forensics revealed that Logan had extensively researched previous school attacks, focusing particularly on methodologies, victim counts, and perpetrators' manifestos. This online behavior, combined with his physical planning and the foundational clue about windows that wouldn't open, created an overwhelming case for premeditation that would become central to the prosecution's strategy as the case moved toward trial in the San Diego County Superior Court. As Detective Johnson prepared to formally present the evidence to the district attorney's office, he conducted a final inspection of the crime scene at Ocean View High School, which remained closed to students as the community mourned. Standing in the now empty cafeteria, with its ocean-themed murals and abundant natural light streaming through windows designed to showcase San Diego's perfect weather, the detective found himself contemplating the contrast between the setting and the violence that had occurred there. The school's open design, with its emphasis on natural light and connection to the outdoors, so typical of Southern California architecture, had inadvertently facilitated Logan's attack by providing multiple entry and exit points. The detective noted in his final report that the foundational clue about windows that wouldn't open represented not just evidence of premeditation, but a chilling insight into how Logan had transformed the school's physical features from their intended purpose of creating a pleasant learning environment into tactical considerations for an act of violence. Prosecutor Elizabeth Harris sat in her sun-filled office in the San Diego County District Attorney's Building, methodically reviewing the evidence binders Detective Johnson had delivered that morning. At 43, with 15 years of experience prosecuting violent crimes, Harris had built a reputation for being thorough, uncompromising, and exceptionally well-prepared, qualities that had led District Attorney Michael Ramirez to assign her to the high-profile Cooper case. The morning light reflected off the harbor, visible through her office windows, creating a glittering display that contrasted sharply with the grim photographs spread across her desk. Crime scene images, autopsy reports, and the recovered pages from Logan Cooper's notebooks detailing his plans. The prosecutor focused particularly on the foundational clue, Logan's question about windows that wouldn't open, recognizing immediately its significance in establishing the premeditated nature of the crime, a crucial element in her decision about how to charge the 16-year-old suspect. Forensic analysis of Logan's computer had yielded a disturbing timeline of escalation that would become central to the prosecution's case. Beginning approximately 7 months before the attack, Logan's search history showed an increasing preoccupation with violence, beginning with general inquiries about bullying statistics and gradually progressing to detailed research on knife attacks, human anatomy focusing on vital organs, and case studies of previous school violence incidents. Tech specialists had recovered deleted files containing maps of Ocean View High School with the cafeteria highlighted and notes about security camera blind spots. Most damning was a folder titled Cafeteria Revenge, created 3 months before the attack, containing meticulously organized subfolders with labels like entry points, timing, and targets. This digital evidence, when combined with the physical notebook found in Logan's backpack and the witness statements about his question regarding windows, created an overwhelming case for premeditation that Harris knew would be essential in her push to try Logan as an adult despite his age. The prosecutor arranged a meeting with Dr. Eleanor Phillips, the county's chief medical examiner, to discuss the autopsy findings for both victims. The clinical setting of the medical examiner's office, with its stark lighting and antiseptic smell, provided a sobering backdrop as Dr. Phillips explained the precise nature of the wounds inflicted on Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson. Both victims suffered multiple stab wounds to the head and chest, with particular focus on the heart, the medical examiner explained, her matter-of-fact tone a professional necessity when dealing with such traumatic material. The pattern of the wounds indicated a level of anatomical knowledge unusual for a teenager, with each strike deliberately placed to maximize damage to vital organs or major blood vessels. Dr. Phillips noted that the angle and depth of the wounds suggested not frenzied, emotional stabbing, but calculated, efficient attacks designed to ensure fatality, evidence that further supported the prosecution's contention that this was not a crime of momentary passion, but a carefully executed plan. While the forensic evidence continued to mount, Harris worked with victim advocate Maria Gonzalez to establish relationships with the families of Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson, recognizing that their testimony about their children's lives and the impact of their deaths would be crucial in humanizing the victims for the jury. These meetings took place in the families' homes rather than the sterile environment of the district attorney's office, allowing Harris to observe firsthand the devastation the crime had wrought. In the Hargrove home, with its walls covered in family photographs and religious iconography, Donna's mother showed the prosecutor her daughter's acceptance letters to prestigious universities and the journal where she had outlined her plans to become a doctor. At the Wilson residence, Ryan's father silently led Harris to his son's bedroom, preserved exactly as it had been on the morning of his death. baseball trophies still gleaming on shelves above a desk where college application essays remained unfinished. These personal details would become part of the narrative Harris would present to the jury, ensuring that Donna and Ryan would be remembered as vibrant, promising young people rather than anonymous statistics. The case against Logan Cooper continued to strengthen as investigators uncovered additional evidence linking the foundational clue to the execution of the crime. School surveillance footage, carefully analyzed by forensic video specialists, revealed Logan conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance of the cafeteria in the weeks before the attack, lingering after lunch periods to observe staff movements and security protocols. One particularly significant clip showed Logan standing near an emergency exit, testing whether the alarm would sound when the door was pushed slightly, knowledge he had apparently incorporated into his planning. Most telling was footage from 3 days before the attack showing Logan in conversation with Jason Chen near the classrooms adjacent to the cafeteria, visibly pointing to windows and making notes. Corroborating both Jason's statement and Ms. Winters' observation about Logan's questions regarding windows that wouldn't open. These visual confirmations of Logan's methodical planning would eventually be compiled into a damning video presentation for the jury, literally showing the steps the teenager had taken toward violence. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of motive came not from Logan's digital devices or notebooks, but from the school's own records, which revealed a systematic failure to address the bullying he had endured. Emails obtained through subpoena showed that Logan's parents had contacted school administrators twice in the previous year regarding concerns about their son being harassed during lunch periods, but the responses had been perfunctory at best. "We'll keep an eye on the situation," wrote Vice Principal Derek Thompson in one such exchange, with no evidence of any follow-up or intervention. Interviews with cafeteria staff confirmed that incidents involving Logan had been observed but dismissed as typical teenage behavior rather than the sustained psychological torture they actually represented. This institutional failure would present a challenge for the prosecution, as it provided context for Logan's fixation on the cafeteria as his target. But Harris remained convinced that understanding the motive did not excuse the methodical planning that had gone into the crime. Psychological evaluations ordered by the court painted a complex picture of the 16-year-old defendant. Dr. Sarah Levine, a forensic psychologist with extensive experience in adolescent cases, conducted multiple sessions with Logan in the juvenile detention facility, where he was being held pending trial. Her report described a teenager with above-average intelligence, but significant deficits in emotional regulation and empathy, exacerbated by the sustained bullying he had experienced. The subject displays a concerning ability to compartmentalize emotions and rationalize extreme responses to perceived injustices, Dr. Levine noted, though she stopped short of diagnosing any specific personality disorder given Logan's age and developmental stage. Most revealing was Logan's response when directly questioned about his victims, whom he referred to as representatives of the system that tormented me, rather than as individual human beings with lives and futures he had destroyed. This dehumanization of his victims, combined with his methodical planning, evidenced by the foundational clue about windows, would become central to the prosecution's argument that Logan represented a calculated threat rather than a confused teenager who had momentarily snapped. As the case moved toward indictment, Prosecutor Harris convened a meeting with District Attorney Ramirez to finalize the decision about whether to charge Logan Cooper as a juvenile or an adult. The stakes of this decision were enormous. If tried as a juvenile, Logan would likely be released upon turning 25, while adult charges could result in a life sentence. The meeting took place in Ramirez's corner office overlooking San Diego's Balboa Park. its formal atmosphere reflecting the gravity of the decision being made. The evidence of premeditation is overwhelming, Harris argued, presenting a detailed timeline that began with Logan's question about windows that wouldn't open and culminated in the methodical execution of the attack. The prosecutor emphasized not just the planning, but the calculated nature of the violence itself, the selection of vital targets on the body, the efficiency of the attack, and the absence of any apparent emotion during or after the killings. After reviewing the evidence, particularly the foundational clue that demonstrated clear forethought, Ramirez authorized charging Logan Cooper as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, charges that carried the possibility of life imprisonment without parole. The formal charging documents were filed with the San Diego County Superior Court on April 2, 2013, 19 days after the attack at Ocean View High School. The prosecution's theory of the case, as outlined in these documents, centered on the transformation of Logan Cooper from bullying victim to methodical killer, with particular emphasis on the foundational clue about windows that wouldn't open as evidence of his careful planning. The defendant's question, overheard by a teacher and corroborated by another student, demonstrates not a momentary breakdown, but a calculated reconnaissance mission as part of a larger plan to commit violence. The charging statement read, establishing the framework for what would become the central argument at trial. The filing of adult charges against the 16-year-old defendant immediately sparked controversy in the San Diego community, with child welfare advocates arguing that Logan's age and the bullying he had endured should mitigate his culpability, while victims' rights groups countered that the heinous and premeditated nature of the crime warranted the most serious consequences available under the law. The formal arrest of Logan Cooper took place on the afternoon of March 14, 2013, just hours after the attack, in an interview room at the San Diego Police Department's Northern Division headquarters. Detective Gabriel Johnson, who had read the 16-year-old his Miranda rights at the school, conducted a more thorough advisement before beginning the official interrogation, with both of Logan's parents and their hastily retained attorney, Martin Goldstein, present. The windowless room, with its institutional gray walls and simple table bolted to the floor, seemed at odds with the Southern California aesthetic that characterized most of San Diego, creating an appropriately serious atmosphere for the gravity of the situation. Logan himself appeared remarkably composed, dressed now in orange juvenile detention clothing that replaced his blood-soaked school attire, his hands no longer bearing the visible evidence of his crimes after having been photographed, swabbed for DNA, and cleaned as part of the booking process. The contrast between the teenager's calm demeanor and the horrific nature of his actions would become a focal point for both prosecution and defense as the case progressed. Detective Johnson began the interrogation with standard background questions, establishing Logan's full name, date of birth, and address, before moving to questions about his understanding of why he had been arrested. "I stabbed 2 people in the cafeteria," Logan responded matter-of-factly, his voice steady and his expression neutral, as if describing a routine school assignment rather than a double homicide. When Johnson asked if Logan knew the names of the people he had stabbed, the teenager shook his head, stating they weren't important as individuals. They were symbols of the system. This chilling response, captured on the interrogation room's video recording system, would later be played for the jury as evidence of Logan's detachment from the human impact of his actions. The detective noted in his report that throughout this initial phase of questioning, Logan maintained consistent eye contact and showed no signs of the emotional distress typically observed in juvenile suspects, an observation that would contribute to the prosecution's eventual decision to pursue adult charges. Approximately 45 minutes into the interrogation, after establishing the basic timeline of events, Detective Johnson introduced the foundational clue that would become central to the case against Logan. "A teacher overheard you asking another student which classrooms had windows that didn't open," Johnson stated, watching carefully for the teenager's reaction. The effect was immediate and striking. For the first time since his arrest, Logan's composed facade cracked, his eyes widening briefly before he regained control of his expression. "That was for a school project," he responded, the slight tremor in his voice betraying the lie. Johnson pressed further, revealing that investigators had also found Logan's notebook containing detailed plans that included maps of the school with specific notations about windows and exit points. Confronted with this evidence of premeditation, Logan's attorney attempted to intervene, but the teenager unexpectedly raised his hand to silence his counsel, stating, "No, I want to explain. I want them to understand why the cafeteria had to become my hunting ground." What followed was a 3-hour confession, delivered with an articulation unusual for a 16-year-old, in which Logan detailed both the planning of his attack and the psychological torment that had motivated it. "For 2 years, I ate lunch in bathroom stalls," he explained, his voice taking on an intensity that contrasted with his previous affect. "Every day they threw food at me. They made oinking noises when I walked by. They created a chant about my weight that hundreds of students would recite." Logan described how he had reported the bullying multiple times to school administrators and cafeteria staff, only to be told to toughen up or ignore it. The systematic failure of the adults who should have protected him had led to his decision to take matters into his own hands, transforming from victim to perpetrator in what he described as an inevitable escalation. Throughout this portion of the confession, Logan's parents sat in stunned silence, occasional tears running down his mother's face as she heard for the first time the full extent of her son's suffering. The interrogation took a darker turn when Detective Johnson steered the conversation back to the specific planning of the attack, particularly Logan's question about windows that wouldn't open. "I needed to know all possible escape routes," Logan explained with disturbing candor, seemingly oblivious to how his words were cementing the case against him. "If the initial attack went as planned, I intended to move to classrooms where students couldn't escape through windows." This revelation, that the stabbings in the cafeteria might have been just the first phase of a more extensive attack, sent a visible shock through the room, with even Logan's attorney appearing momentarily at a loss for words. Johnson, maintaining his professional composure despite the chilling implications of this statement, asked why Logan had ultimately not proceeded with this expanded plan. "The security officer tackled me sooner than I expected," Logan replied, with what seemed like disappointment. "My timing calculations were off by approximately 40 seconds. When questioned specifically about his choice of victims, Logan confirmed what the investigation had already suggested, that Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson had not been targeted for personal reasons, but had simply been in the most accessible positions when he entered the cafeteria. It wasn't about them as individuals, he stated, reinforcing his earlier characterization of the victims as symbols. "The cafeteria was where I was tormented, so the cafeteria had to be where I took control." This dissociation from the humanity of his victims, combined with his methodical planning, evidenced by the foundational clue about windows, painted a disturbing picture of a teenager who had developed a warped moral framework in which mass violence could be justified as an appropriate response to personal suffering. Throughout this portion of the interrogation, Detective Johnson carefully avoided any statements that might appear sympathetic to this rationalization, aware that the video recording would likely be seen by the victims' families and eventually by a jury. The most revealing moment of the interrogation came when Johnson showed Logan photographs of Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson, not crime scene photos, but school portraits showing the vibrant teenagers whose lives he had taken. For the first time, Logan's composure fully crumbled, not in remorse for his actions, but in anger at what he perceived as an attempt to manipulate him emotionally. "Don't try to make me see them as people," he said, pushing the photographs away with enough force to send them sliding across the interview table. "The moment they stood by and watched while I was humiliated day after day, they stopped being people to me." This visceral reaction, captured clearly on the interrogation video, would later be cited by the prosecution as evidence of Logan's dangerous inability to recognize the humanity of others, a key factor in the decision to pursue adult charges despite his age. It also revealed the extent to which the daily cafeteria humiliation had warped Logan's perception, creating a worldview divided simply into tormentors and the tormented. As the interrogation entered its fifth hour, with brief breaks only for water and restroom use, Logan's attorney finally insisted on concluding the session, citing his client's minor status and the length of questioning. Detective Johnson, having obtained significant admissions that established both the fact of the crime and the crucial element of premeditation, agreed to end the formal interview. Before Logan was returned to his holding cell, however, the detective asked one final question that would yield perhaps the most damning statement of all. "Do you regret what you did?" Johnson asked, his tone carefully neutral. Logan considered the question for several long moments before responding. "I regret that I didn't get to finish what I started. The cafeteria was just the beginning." This statement, made as almost an afterthought at the conclusion of a marathon interrogation, would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case that Logan Cooper represented an ongoing danger to society who should be tried and sentenced as an adult, despite his chronological age. The formal charging decision came 3 days later, after prosecutors had reviewed the interrogation video and compared Logan's statements with the physical evidence collected from the crime scene and his home. District Attorney Michael Ramirez announced at a press conference held on the steps of the San Diego County Courthouse that Logan Cooper would be charged as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, charges that carried the possibility of life imprisonment without parole. The methodical planning evidenced by the defendant's question about windows that wouldn't open, combined with his own statements about intending a larger attack and his lack of remorse, leave us no choice but to pursue the most serious charges available under California law, Ramirez stated, the Pacific Ocean visible in the distance behind him as he addressed the assembled media. The decision was immediately controversial in the San Diego community, with child welfare advocates organizing protests, arguing that Logan's age and history as a bullying victim should mitigate the charges, while supporters of the victims' families countered that the heinous and premeditated nature of the crime warranted adult consequences. In the days following the interrogation and formal charges, Logan Cooper was transferred from juvenile detention to a segregated section of the San Diego Central Jail, where he would remain throughout the trial process. The teenager adapted to his new environment with the same unnerving composure he had shown during most of his interrogation, following routines precisely and interacting minimally with both staff and the few other juvenile defendants being held as adults. Jail personnel reports, which would later be submitted as evidence during sentencing, described Logan as a model prisoner who spent most of his time reading books on philosophy and psychology borrowed from the jail's limited library. Most concerning to the psychiatric staff who evaluated him regularly was his apparent lack of emotional response to his situation. No anger, no sadness, no remorse, just a detached analytical approach to his circumstances that one staff psychologist described as profoundly abnormal for a 16-year-old facing life in prison. This emotional flatness, combined with his detailed planning and the chilling statements made during his interrogation about the cafeteria becoming his hunting ground, created a picture of a young man who, despite his age, had methodically transformed himself from victim to predator. The trial of Logan Cooper began on September 16, 2013, 6 months after the stabbings at Ocean View High School, in the main courtroom of the San Diego County Superior Court. The Spanish colonial architecture of the courthouse, with its white stucco walls and red tile roof, reflected the city's heritage and typically projected an atmosphere of dignified calm. But on this morning, the building was surrounded by media trucks, protesters with competing agendas, and a heavy police presence ensuring security. Inside Courtroom 3A, with its polished wood paneling and state seal mounted behind the judge's bench, the atmosphere was tense but controlled as Judge Raymond Mills called the proceedings to order. The defendant, Logan Cooper, now 17 years old, entered wearing a blue button-down shirt and khaki pants provided by his defense team to replace his jail uniform, the civilian clothes an attempt to humanize him in the eyes of the jury. The teenager's physical appearance had changed noticeably during his 6 months in custody. He had lost weight, his complexion had paled from lack of sunlight, and his previously shaggy hair had been cut into a neat, conservative style. But his demeanor remained the same, calm, observant, and unsettlingly detached from the gravity of the proceedings. The jury selection process had been particularly challenging, requiring 3 weeks and over 200 potential jurors to finally seat 12 primary jurors and 4 alternates who could convince both prosecution and defense that they would evaluate the evidence fairly despite the extensive pretrial publicity. The final panel reflected San Diego's diversity, 7 women and 5 men ranging in age from 26 to 73, with varied ethnic backgrounds and occupations including a retired naval officer, a university professor, a supermarket manager, and a surfing instructor. Judge Mills, known for his no-nonsense approach and meticulous attention to procedural details, had granted a change of venue motion for jury selection, bringing in potential jurors from neighboring Imperial County to reduce the impact of local media coverage. As the jurors filed in and took their seats, many glanced curiously at Logan, who returned their gazes with an unsettling directness that caused several to look away quickly, an interaction not lost on prosecutor Elizabeth Harris, who had anticipated the jury's natural discomfort with a defendant who was simultaneously so young and accused of such horrific crimes. The trial began with opening statements, with Prosecutor Harris addressing the jury first, her navy blue suit and minimal jewelry reflecting the serious, professional approach she would maintain throughout the proceedings. This case is about premeditation, calculation, and the transformation of a school cafeteria into what the defendant himself called his hunting ground, she began, her voice clear and deliberate in the hushed courtroom. Harris outlined the prosecution's case methodically, emphasizing the timeline of Logan's planning and particularly highlighting the foundational clue, his question about windows that wouldn't open, as evidence of his methodical preparation. 3 days before the attack, a teacher overheard the defendant asking which classrooms had windows that couldn't be opened from the inside, she told the jury, explaining how this seemingly innocuous question revealed Logan's reconnaissance for potential attack and escape routes. The prosecutor acknowledged the bullying Logan had endured, but argued firmly that understanding the motive did not excuse the crime. Many teenagers experience bullying, but they don't respond with calculated murder. Defense attorney Martin Goldstein, a veteran criminal defender known for handling high-profile juvenile cases, presented a starkly different narrative in his opening statement. Dressed in a slightly rumpled gray suit that contrasted with the prosecutor's polished appearance, Goldstein portrayed Logan as a child failed by every system designed to protect him. What you will hear in this courtroom is the story of a young man who reported bullying 14 times to school administrators and was ignored 14 times, he told the jury, his voice rising with controlled indignation. You will hear how he ate his lunches in bathroom stalls to escape the torment, how he begged to change schools, how he contemplated suicide before he contemplated violence. Goldstein did not deny that Logan had committed the stabbings, but argued that his actions should be viewed through the lens of his age, his psychological development, and the systematic torture he had endured in the school cafeteria. The defense attorney concluded by urging the jury to remember that the law recognizes that children are different from adults neurologically, psychologically, and morally. And Logan Cooper, despite the adult charges he faces, was and is a child whose brain is still developing. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders and crime scene investigators, establishing the basic facts of the attack through physical evidence and photographs that had been carefully edited to balance the jury's need to understand the crime's brutality with ethical concerns about unnecessary graphic content. San Diego police officer Miguel Rodriguez, the first law enforcement officer to arrive at Ocean View High School after the stabbings, described finding the cafeteria in chaos, with 2 victims already beyond medical help, and the suspect restrained by school security personnel. Crime scene technician Jennifer Park walked the jury through diagrams of the cafeteria, using laser pointers to indicate the positions of the victims, the blood spatter patterns that revealed the sequence of the attack, and the location where the murder weapon had been recovered. Medical examiner Dr. Eleanor Phillips provided clinical testimony about the cause of death for both Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson, using anatomical models rather than autopsy photos to demonstrate how the stab wounds had targeted vital organs with a precision unusual for crimes of passion, supporting the prosecution's theory of calculated planning rather than emotional outburst. The prosecution's strategy crystallized around the foundational clue when English teacher Andrea Winters took the stand on the trial's 3rd day, her testimony representing a turning point in establishing the premeditated nature of the crime. Ms. Winters, dressed conservatively in a high-necked blouse and cardigan despite the September heat, recounted how she had overheard Logan asking another student about classrooms with windows that wouldn't open just 3 days before the attack. "At the time, I thought it might be for a science project or safety article," she explained, visible guilt crossing her face as she glanced briefly at the victims' families seated in the front row of the gallery. "In hindsight, I realize he was gathering information for his attack plan." Under Prosecutor Harris's careful questioning, Ms. Winters established that Logan's inquiry had been specific and detailed, focusing particularly on classrooms near the cafeteria. This testimony was corroborated by student Jason Chen, who described how Logan had approached him with questions about emergency exits and window types, under the pretense of writing an article for the school newspaper, even asking to see the building's floor plan that was kept in the newspaper office. Detective Gabriel Johnson's testimony spanned 2 full days, providing the jury with a comprehensive overview of the investigation, and particularly focusing on the evidence of premeditation discovered in Logan's home, on his digital devices, and in his own statements during interrogation. The detective presented a timeline of Logan's planning, beginning with generalized research about knife attacks 7 months before the incident, and progressing to increasingly specific preparations, including diagrams of the school, with notations about security camera placements and staff patrol patterns. Johnson described finding a notebook in Logan's backpack at the crime scene containing a hand-drawn map of the cafeteria with entry points marked and optimal attack positions noted. Most damaging to the defense was the detective's account of Logan's statements during interrogation, particularly his admission that the cafeteria attack was intended to be just the beginning, and that he had planned to target classrooms where students couldn't escape through windows, directly tying his actions to the foundational clue that Ms. Winters had overheard. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by digital forensics expert Dr. Raymond Chen, who presented recovered files from Logan's computer showing extensive research on previous school attacks, human anatomy, focusing on vital organs, and methods for ensuring fatality with a knife. Dr. Chen walked the jury through Logan's search history, highlighting phrases like quickest way to kill with a knife and arteries in the neck and chest, searches conducted weeks before the attack that contradicted any claim of momentary passion. Perhaps most disturbing was a folder labeled Cafeteria Revenge, containing a methodical plan divided into phases, with subfolders dedicated to timing, targeting, and escape routes. The expert also presented Logan's private journal entries recovered from his hard drive, projecting onto a large screen in the courtroom, his chilling description of the cafeteria as their stadium where I've been their entertainment that would become my hunting ground, language that directly echoed his statements during interrogation and established a clear through line from planning to execution of the crime. As the first week of trial concluded, the prosecution called several student witnesses who testified about the bullying Logan had endured, strategically addressing this aspect of the case rather than leaving it entirely to the defense. These testimonies painted a disturbing picture of systematic harassment centered around the school cafeteria, with multiple students describing incidents of food being thrown, trays being knocked over, and organized chants about Logan's weight. Several witnesses admitted their own complicity, either through direct participation or failure to intervene, creating visible discomfort among jury members who shifted in their seats and avoided eye contact with both the witnesses and the defendant. This testimony supported the prosecution's narrative about Logan's motive, while simultaneously allowing Prosecutor Harris to acknowledge the context without excusing the crime. The bullying Logan Cooper experienced was real and inexcusable, she noted during questioning. But did that justify methodical planning to kill classmates who had nothing to do with his torment? The prosecution's final witness, before turning to the victims' families, was Dr. Sarah Levine, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Logan while he was in custody awaiting trial. Dr. Levine's testimony walked a careful line between acknowledging the impact of bullying on adolescent development and asserting that Logan's response fell far outside typical reactions, even accounting for trauma. What distinguishes this case from typical adolescent crisis responses is the extensive planning, the emotional detachment, and the selection of victims who were not directly involved in the defendant's bullying, she explained to the jury. Dr. Levine described Logan as exhibiting concerning patterns of thought, including dehumanization of peers, compartmentalization of emotions, and a rigid worldview divided into victims and perpetrators with no middle ground. While careful not to diagnose specific personality disorders given Logan's age, the psychologist testified that his question about windows that wouldn't open, combined with his detailed planning and lack of apparent remorse, suggested a level of calculated intent more commonly associated with adult offenders than with adolescents acting on impulse. This expert testimony directly addressed the central question the jury would have to consider: whether Logan Cooper, despite his chronological age, had demonstrated the kind of premeditation and intent that warranted adult consequences. The eighth day of trial began with a palpable shift in the courtroom atmosphere as Prosecutor Elizabeth Harris called Andrea Winters back to the stand for additional testimony, specifically focusing on the foundational clue that had become central to the case. The English teacher, who had appeared briefly earlier in the proceedings, now returned to provide more detailed context about Logan's question regarding windows that wouldn't open. He wasn't just asking which classrooms had windows that couldn't be opened, Ms. Winters clarified, her voice steady despite the weight of her testimony. He was specifically asking about classrooms near emergency exits and whether the windows in the science wing had been permanently sealed after the renovation last year. The prosecutor guided Ms. Winters through a detailed reconstruction of the conversation she had overheard, establishing that Logan's questions had been methodical and specific rather than casual curiosity, focusing particularly on escape routes and containment areas that aligned perfectly with the plans later found in his possession. This testimony directly contradicted the defense's position that the attack had been an impulsive response to ongoing trauma, instead supporting the prosecution's narrative of careful, deliberate planning. Expert testimony from Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a nationally recognized authority on adolescent violence from the University of California, San Diego, provided crucial context for the jury about the significance of Logan's question regarding windows. In my 30 years of studying school violence cases, one of the most consistent warning signs is what we call environmental scanning, the perpetrator gathering specific information about the physical layout of the target location, Dr. Reynolds explained, his academic tone lending authority to his statements. Using a digital presentation displayed on screens throughout the courtroom, the expert walked the jury through previous cases where such reconnaissance had preceded attacks, drawing direct parallels to Logan's behavior in the days before the stabbings. The question about windows that wouldn't open represents classic pre-attack planning, Dr. Reynolds testified, specifically focusing on containment and escape considerations that indicate a level of premeditation inconsistent with claims of impulsive action. This testimony was particularly damaging to the defense strategy, as it placed Logan's behavior in a pattern recognized by experts as indicative of planned rather than reactive violence. The prosecution's case reached an emotional crescendo with the testimony of Maria Hargrove, Donna's mother, who spoke through an interpreter about her daughter's dreams of becoming a doctor and the devastating impact of her death on their family. Dressed in black, with a silver crucifix visible at her neck, Mrs. Hargrove held a framed photograph of Donna in her graduation gown from junior year, the image facing the jury throughout her testimony. "She was the first in our family who would go to college," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice breaking despite her evident determination to maintain composure. "She wanted to be a pediatrician to help children in communities like ours where many families cannot afford good medical care." The grieving mother described how Donna had received a full scholarship to Stanford University just weeks before her death, an achievement that had filled their household with joy that was now replaced by an emptiness that Mrs. Hargrove described as a physical pain that never leaves my chest. Throughout this testimony, Logan Cooper maintained the same detached expression he had shown throughout the trial, a lack of visible emotion that several jurors appeared to notice, with one elderly woman openly wiping tears while glancing repeatedly at the defendant's impassive face. Thomas Wilson, Ryan's father, provided equally powerful testimony about his son's life and the impact of his murder, describing the baseball scholarship to UCLA that Ryan would never use and the professional dreams that would never be realized. Ryan wanted to play college baseball and then become a physical therapist, inspired by the therapist who helped him recover from a shoulder injury 2 years ago, Mr. Wilson testified, his voice steady but strained with the effort of maintaining control. He spoke of finding his son's baseball equipment still in the trunk of his car after the murder, the dirt from his last practice still on his cleats, and how he couldn't bring himself to clean it or put it away. Unlike Mrs. Hargrove, Mr. Wilson directly addressed Logan during his testimony, looking at the defendant and stating, "I want to hate you, but mostly, I want to understand how you could plan so carefully to kill someone you didn't even know." This direct confrontation created a tense moment in the courtroom, with Judge Mills reminding witnesses to direct their comments to the court rather than the defendant, though the emotional impact of the moment was evident in the jury's expressions of sympathy and, in some cases, barely concealed anger directed toward Logan. The defense began presenting its case on the trial's 10th day, calling Dr. Elaine Park, a pediatric neurologist specializing in adolescent brain development, as its first expert witness. Dr. Park presented brain scans and research data illustrating the incomplete development of the prefrontal cortex in teenagers, the region responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and understanding consequences. The adolescent brain, particularly the areas involved in emotional regulation and decision-making, is simply not fully developed until the mid-20s, she testified, directly challenging the prosecution's emphasis on Logan's calculated planning. Dr. Park argued that Logan's question about windows that wouldn't open while appearing to demonstrate adult-like premeditation should be understood in the context of his developmental stage and the neurological storm created by 2 years of sustained bullying. Adolescents under extreme stress can engage in what appears to be planning behavior, but is actually a manifestation of fixation and obsession rather than the kind of rational deliberation we associate with adult premeditation, she explained, suggesting that Logan's actions reflected a brain in crisis rather than mature, considered decision-making. School counselor Diane Rodriguez provided testimony that supported the defense's portrayal of systemic failure, describing how Logan had been referred to her office twice for declining academic performance, but had never received substantive intervention. "Our counseling department is severely understaffed," Ms. Rodriguez admitted, noting that with a student-to-counselor ratio of 580 to 1, she was able to provide only minimal support to struggling students. The counselor testified that Logan had mentioned problems at lunch during one brief session but had not elaborated, and she had not had the time to follow up or investigate what those problems might entail. When defense attorney Goldstein asked whether the school had protocols in place for identifying and addressing bullying, Ms. Rodriguez acknowledged that while such protocols existed on paper, the resources to implement them effectively were lacking. "We have anti-bullying posters in the hallways," she said, "but we don't have enough staff to monitor the cafeteria consistently or to investigate every reported incident." This testimony supported the defense's narrative that Logan had been failed by the very institutions tasked with protecting him, contributing to the psychological pressure that had ultimately exploded in violence. The defense strategy pivoted directly to addressing the foundational clue when they called Dr. James Morris, a forensic psychiatrist specializing in adolescent trauma response, to provide context for Logan's question about windows that wouldn't open. "When we look at this question in isolation, it appears calculated and sinister," Dr. Morris acknowledged. "But when we place it within the context of a severely bullied teenager who had developed what we call perseverative ideation, obsessive thought patterns focused on escape from an intolerable situation, it takes on a different meaning." The psychiatrist suggested that Logan's focus on windows and exits reflected a mind desperately seeking control in an environment where he felt perpetually trapped and humiliated. The cafeteria had become a place of such consistent torment that his psychological response included both escape fantasies and revenge fantasies, Dr. Morris testified, and his questions about windows represented the blurring of these two mental tracks rather than clear, adult-like premeditation. This interpretation directly challenged the prosecution's framing of the foundational clue, offering an alternative explanation that emphasized Logan's youth and psychological distress rather than calculated intent. In a risky but potentially powerful strategy, the defense called several of Logan's former classmates who had witnessed or participated in the bullying he had endured. Basketball team captain Marcus Williams, visibly uncomfortable in the witness box, admitted to seeing Logan being harassed pretty much every day in the cafeteria, but doing nothing to intervene. "It was like an unwritten rule that Cooper was fair game," he testified, unable to make eye contact with either Logan or the victims' families. People would throw food at him, knock his tray over, make oinking noises when he walked by. Nobody stopped it. Not the teachers on lunch duty, not the cafeteria staff, nobody. When asked by defense attorney Goldstein whether he had ever reported these incidents, Marcus shook his head. "I didn't want to get involved. I figured it wasn't my problem." Similar testimonies from other students created a disturbing picture of systemic cruelty tolerated and even tacitly encouraged by a school culture that prioritized social hierarchy over compassion or intervention, supporting the defense's position that Logan had been pushed beyond normal adolescent coping mechanisms by extraordinary circumstances. The most controversial testimony came from Logan Cooper himself, who took the stand against the advice of his attorney, but with the insistence of his parents, who believed the jury needed to hear directly from their son. Dressed in a navy blue sweater over a white button-down shirt that emphasized his youth and made him look more like the honor student he had once been than the defendant in a murder trial, Logan spoke in a clear, articulate manner that contrasted with the emotional testimony of previous witnesses. He described in clinical detail the daily torment he had experienced in the cafeteria, from having food thrown at him to being subjected to organized chants about his weight that hundreds of students would join. "After the first year, I started eating in bathroom stalls," he testified, his voice devoid of the emotion one might expect when recounting such experiences. "I reported it 14 times to teachers, counselors, and administrators. Nothing changed except that the bullies became more careful to only torment me when no adults were watching." When prosecution cross-examined him about his question regarding windows that wouldn't open, Logan's response was chilling in its directness. "I needed to know all potential exits in case security responded faster than I calculated. The windows were a contingency variable in my plan." This admission, delivered without apparent awareness of its damaging nature, visibly shocked several jurors and undermined the defense's portrayal of Logan as acting from uncontrollable trauma rather than calculated intent. The final day of testimony featured rebuttal witnesses from both prosecution and defense, with each side attempting to reinforce their core narrative about the significance of the foundational clue. Prosecutor Harris recalled Detective Johnson, who presented additional evidence from Logan's computer showing that he had researched the specific type of security glass used in the school's science wing windows. Information that supported the prosecution's contention that his question about windows had been part of methodical planning rather than generalized anxiety or escape fantasies. The defense countered with Dr. Eleanor Hughes, an expert in adolescent psychology, who testified that Logan's focus on details like windows represented tunnel vision induced by trauma rather than the kind of rational planning associated with adult criminals. When adolescents experience sustained psychological torment, they can develop hyper-focused thought patterns that appear premeditated but are actually manifestations of trauma response, Dr. Hughes explained, urging the jury to consider Logan's actions within the context of his developmental stage and the extraordinary psychological pressure created by 2 years of daily humiliation. These competing expert interpretations of the foundational clue left the jury with the central question they would need to resolve: whether Logan Cooper's question about windows that wouldn't open represented the calculated planning of a dangerous individual deserving adult punishment, or the desperate fixation of a traumatized teenager failed by the systems meant to protect him. After 15 days of testimony, 97 witnesses, and hundreds of pieces of evidence, the case of the state of California vs. Logan Cooper was finally in the hands of the jury. Judge Raymond Mills delivered his instructions on the morning of October 4, 2013, his authoritative voice filling the hushed courtroom as he explained the legal standards for first-degree murder, the special circumstances alleged by the prosecution, and the factors the jury should consider In evaluating the evidence, you must determine whether the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed these acts with premeditation and deliberation, Judge Mills instructed, emphasizing that the defendant's age could be considered as context but did not change the legal elements required for conviction. The judge specifically addressed the foundational clue that had become central to the case, noting that evidence regarding the defendant's question about windows that wouldn't open may be considered in determining whether there was planning activity indicating premeditation. As the 12 jurors filed out to begin their deliberations, Logan Cooper sat impassively between his attorneys, his expression unchanged throughout the judge's instructions, while the families of Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson clutched each other's hands in the front row of the gallery, the culmination of their 6-month quest for justice finally within sight. The jury deliberations extended over 5 full days, an unusually long period that reflected the complexity of the case and the serious implications of their decision for a defendant who, despite the adult charges, was still chronologically a teenager. Court observers noted that the jury had requested several readbacks of testimony, particularly the statements of Ms. Winters regarding Logan's question about windows and Dr. Morris's alternative interpretation of the significance of that question. They also asked to review Logan's own testimony and the digital evidence recovered from his computer, suggesting a meticulous examination of the evidence related to premeditation. The length of deliberations created palpable tension throughout San Diego, with media encamped outside the courthouse and social media platforms filled with debate about juvenile justice, school bullying, and the appropriate balance between accountability and rehabilitation for young offenders. The Cooper family waited in a private room within the courthouse, while the Hargrove and Wilson families found support in each other's company at a nearby church that had opened its doors to provide them sanctuary from the media spotlight. At 2:17 p.m. on October 9, 2013, the jury notified the court that they had reached a verdict, and the courtroom quickly filled to capacity as Judge Mills reconvened the proceedings. The tension in the room was almost physical, with journalists poised over notebooks, family members gripping each other's hands, and the attorneys for both sides sitting unnaturally still as they awaited the decision that would culminate months of work. Logan Cooper, who throughout the trial had maintained an unsettling calm, showed the first signs of stress, his left hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his collar before the jury entered. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman who worked as a university librarian, handed the verdict form to the court clerk, who in turn passed it to Judge Mills for review. The judge's face remained impassive as he examined the document, then returned it to the clerk with a nod, instructing, "Please read the verdict." The clerk rose, and in a clear voice that would be heard not only by those in the courtroom, but by millions watching the live coverage on television and streaming services, announced, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Logan Cooper, guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances in the death of Donna Hargrove. We, the jury, find the defendant, Logan Cooper, guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances in the death of Ryan Wilson." The courtroom reaction was immediate but subdued, reflecting the somber nature of the proceedings despite their emotional weight. Maria Hargrove, Donna's mother, closed her eyes and crossed herself, tears streaming silently down her face, while next to her, Thomas Wilson placed his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Logan's mother collapsed against his father, who maintained a stoic expression despite the visible devastation in his eyes. Logan himself showed the most emotion he had displayed throughout the entire trial, his face paling and his shoulders slumping slightly forward, though he remained silent and controlled even in this moment of reckoning. Judge Mills thanked the jury for their service and set a sentencing date for November 15, 2013, noting that pre-sentencing reports would need to be prepared given the defendant's age. As deputies prepared to return Logan to custody, he turned briefly toward his parents, making eye contact for just a moment before being led from the courtroom. Outside, the reaction was more vocal, with supporters of the victims' families cheering the verdict while a smaller group of juvenile justice advocates held a silent vigil with signs reading, "Children are not adults, and trauma is not an excuse, but it is a reason." In the month between verdict and sentencing, the case continued to generate intense debate across San Diego and beyond, with legal experts, child welfare advocates, victims' rights groups, and educational policymakers all weighing in on its implications. The pre-sentencing report, portions of which were leaked to the media despite court orders, revealed that psychiatric evaluations conducted after the verdict suggested Logan showed concerning patterns consistent with developing antisocial tendencies, but stopped short of any formal diagnosis given his age and still developing brain. The foundational clue, Logan's question about windows that wouldn't open, remained central to discussions about the case, with some arguing it clearly demonstrated the kind of premeditation that justified an adult sentence, while others maintained it reflected the desperate thought patterns of a traumatized adolescent, failed by multiple systems. Public opinion in San Diego was sharply divided, with a San Diego Union Tribune poll showing 58% of respondents supporting a life sentence, while 42% favored a juvenile sentence with possibility of release after. Rehabilitation, a split that reflected broader national debates about appropriate consequences for juvenile offenders who commit adult crimes. The sentencing hearing on November 15, 2013, drew even more attention than the verdict announcement, with demonstrators from both sides gathering outside the San Diego County Courthouse from the early morning hours. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity, with victims' advocates, juvenile justice representatives, and members of the press occupying every available seat. Before Judge Mills announced his decision, both prosecution and defense were permitted to make final statements, and the victims' families were given the opportunity to deliver impact statements. Maria Hargrove spoke first, addressing the court in Spanish through an interpreter, her voice steady despite her evident grief. "My Donna wanted to heal people, to save lives as a doctor. Instead, her life was taken by someone who made a choice, a calculated, deliberate choice, to turn his pain into violence." Thomas Wilson followed, speaking directly to Logan as he had attempted to do during his testimony. "I've thought about you every day since you killed my son. I've tried to understand how a person your age could plan something so methodical, how you could ask about windows that wouldn't open while already knowing you intended to use a knife to take my son's life. I haven't found that understanding, and I don't think I ever will." Defense attorney Martin Goldstein made an impassioned plea for leniency in sentencing, emphasizing Logan's age and the neurological research suggesting adolescent brains are not fully developed, particularly in areas related to impulse control and long-term decision-making. The Logan Cooper who sits before you today is not the person he will be at 25 or 30 or 40, Goldstein argued, urging Judge Mills to consider a sentence that would allow for eventual rehabilitation and release. The question about windows that has been central to this case must be understood in the context of a teenage brain pushed to its breaking point by systematic torment that no child should have to endure. The defense attorney introduced letters from child psychiatrists, education policy experts, and juvenile justice advocates, all urging the court to consider alternatives to the maximum sentence given Logan's age and the circumstances that had contributed to his actions. Goldstein concluded by reminding the court that a civilized justice system must consider not only the horror of the crime, but the capacity for change in a mind that is still developing, still becoming the person it will ultimately be. Prosecutor Elizabeth Harris countered with a focus on the calculated nature of the crime and the clear evidence of premeditation, particularly emphasizing the foundational clue about windows as indicative of Logan's methodical planning. The defendant's question was not an idle curiosity or a manifestation of trauma. It was reconnaissance for an attack he had been planning for months, Harris argued, her tone authoritative rather than emotional. The evidence presented at trial established beyond any doubt that Logan Cooper approached this crime with a level of calculation more commonly associated with experienced adult offenders than with impulsive adolescents. The prosecutor acknowledged the reality of the bullying Logan had experienced, but maintained that it explained rather than excused his actions, particularly given the random selection of victims who had not participated in his harassment. Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson were chosen not because of anything they had done to the defendant, but simply because they were in accessible positions when he entered the cafeteria with murder in his heart, Harris stated, urging Judge Mills to impose the maximum sentence available under California law, life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. After hearing from all parties, Judge Raymond Mills delivered his sentencing decision in a courtroom so silent that the soft hum of the air conditioning system seemed thunderous by comparison. The case before me today presents one of the most difficult balancing acts the court can face, the judge began, noting the tension between acknowledging the defendant's youth and developmental stage and addressing the severity of his crime and the clear evidence of premeditation. Judge Mills specifically referenced the foundational clue, stating that the defendant's question about windows that wouldn't open, when considered alongside the other evidence of planning found in his writings and digital devices, demonstrates a level of calculation that cannot be dismissed as merely adolescent impulsivity or trauma response. The judge acknowledged the failures of the school system to address the bullying Logan had experienced, but emphasized that these contextual factors, while important for understanding, did not negate the deliberate choices Logan had made in planning and executing his attack. After methodically reviewing the applicable law and the specific circumstances of the case, Judge Mills delivered his decision. It is the sentence of this court that the defendant, Logan Cooper, be committed to the California Department of Corrections for a term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The reaction to the sentence was immediate and visceral, dividing the courtroom and the broader community as sharply as the case itself had done. As Judge Mills uttered the words, "Lock him up forever," audible gasps and sobs came from both the victims' families and Logan's parents. Maria Hargrove collapsed into the arms of Thomas Wilson, their shared grief momentarily transcending their separate losses, while Linda Cooper screamed, "No," before being quietly restrained by her husband. Logan himself showed the first genuine emotional reaction since his arrest, his composure finally cracking as the reality of spending his entire life in prison registered on his young face. Outside the courthouse, the announcement triggered competing demonstrations, with victims' advocates calling the sentence appropriate justice for a calculated double murder, while juvenile justice reformers condemned it as excessively harsh for an offender who had not yet reached full neurological development. San Diego Mayor Frank Reynolds issued a statement calling for community healing and reforms to school anti-bullying programs, while acknowledging that no outcome of this case could have fully satisfied everyone's sense of justice given the complex and tragic circumstances involved. The sentencing marked the end of the formal legal proceedings, but not the community's reckoning with the case and its implications. Appeals were immediately filed by Logan's defense team, challenging both the decision to try him as an adult and the constitutionality of life without parole sentences for offenders under 18, though legal experts noted these appeals faced significant hurdles given the evidence of premeditation, particularly the foundational clue about windows that had become so central to the case. the San Diego Unified School District announced a comprehensive review of its anti-bullying policies, with particular focus on cafeteria monitoring and improved response protocols for reported incidents of harassment. The Hargrove and Wilson families established a joint foundation dedicated to preventing school violence through early intervention programs. Their shared loss transformed into a mission to ensure other families would be spared similar tragedy. As Logan Cooper began his sentence at a specialized unit for juvenile offenders within the adult prison system, the questions his case had raised about justice, rehabilitation, adolescent development, and institutional responsibility continued to reverberate through courtrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across America, ensuring that the tragedy at Ocean View High School would have implications far beyond the city of San Diego and the lives directly touched by the events of March 14, 2013. In the immediate aftermath of Logan Cooper's sentencing, the case sparked a nationwide debate about juvenile justice, with legal scholars, child welfare advocates, and victims' rights groups weighing in on the appropriateness of sentencing a 16-year-old to life without parole. The Supreme Court had previously ruled in Miller v. Alabama, 2012, that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional, but had left open the possibility of such sentences in cases of extreme premeditation or particular heinousness. Law journals and academic publications featured articles analyzing Judge Mills's decision with particular focus on how the foundational clue, Logan's question about windows that wouldn't open, had been central to establishing the premeditation that justified an adult sentence. The American Bar Association convened a Resto special panel on juvenile justice in San Diego in February 2014, where experts debated whether the neurological reality of adolescent brain development should take precedence over evidence of calculation in determining appropriate sentences for teenage offenders. While no consensus emerged from these discussions, the Cooper case became a reference point in legal education and a catalyst for more nuanced considerations of how the justice system should respond to juvenile crimes that appear to demonstrate adult-like premeditation. Ocean View High School remained closed for 2 weeks following the stabbings, reopening with enhanced security measures and a comprehensive support system for traumatized students and staff. The cafeteria where the attacks had occurred was completely renovated, with the layout changed, new furniture installed, and a memorial to Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson established in a peaceful corner of the space, a deliberate choice to reclaim the location rather than allowing it to remain permanently associated with violence. Principal Diana Mendez implemented mandatory anti-bullying training for all staff and students, with particular emphasis on cafeteria monitoring and clear reporting protocols for observed harassment. Perhaps most significant was the establishment of the Lighthouse, a dedicated space within the school staffed by counselors where students could seek help for bullying, mental health concerns, or other challenges, addressing the lack of resources that had contributed to Logan Cooper's isolation and escalation. These reforms spread beyond Ocean View to other schools in the San Diego Unified School District and eventually became a model for districts across California, creating a tangible policy legacy from the tragedy. The Hargrove and Wilson families channeled their grief into activism, establishing the Donna and Ryan Foundation for School Safety, which focused on bullying prevention, mental health resources in schools, and support for families affected by school violence. What began as a local memorial effort grew into a nationally recognized organization with chapters in 27 states by 2018, 5 years after the tragedy. Maria Hargrove, who had spoken little English at the time of her daughter's death, became a powerful public speaker who addressed state legislatures and educational conferences about the importance of creating school environments where all students feel safe and valued. Thomas Wilson left his executive position to work full-time with the foundation, developing programs that trained school staff to recognize warning signs of both bullying victimization and potential violence. The foundation's most successful initiative, Cafeteria Connections, specifically addressed the dynamics of school lunch periods, transforming these often unstructured and minimally supervised times into opportunities for community building and inclusion, directly addressing the context in which Logan Cooper had experienced the bullying that ultimately drove him to violence. Logan Cooper's parents, Thomas and Linda, initially withdrew from public view after their son's sentencing, overwhelmed by grief, guilt, and the hostility they faced from some members of the San Diego community who held them partially responsible for their son's actions. The couple eventually divorced in 2015, with Linda moving to Oregon to escape the persistent association with the case, while Thomas remained in San Diego and eventually began speaking publicly about the warning signs they had missed in their son's behavior. We asked if everything was okay, and he said fine, so we thought it was fine. Thomas Cooper told a parents group in 2016, his voice heavy with regret. We didn't push, we didn't investigate, we didn't look at his computer or notice when the knife went missing from our collection. We trusted that if there was a serious problem, the school would let us know. Thomas eventually joined forces with the Donna and Ryan Foundation, providing the perspective of a perpetrator's parent in their educational materials and helping develop protocols for family engagement in bullying prevention efforts, his participation representing an unexpected bridge between the families affected by the tragedy and a powerful testament to the possibility of finding constructive responses even to the most devastating circumstances. The case left a lasting impact on the legal career of prosecutor Elizabeth Harris, who found herself increasingly focused on the intersection of juvenile justice and public safety. In 2017, Harris was appointed to a state commission on juvenile justice reform, where she advocated for a more nuanced approach to cases involving teenage offenders while maintaining her belief that certain crimes demonstrate a level of premeditation that warrants adult consequences. The Cooper case taught me that these situations resist simple categorization, Harris stated in an interview marking the 5-year anniversary of the trial. The foundational clue, his question about windows that wouldn't open, clearly demonstrated planning, but we should have had more options between treating him exactly like an adult or exactly like a child. Harris went on to help draft legislation creating an intermediate sentencing category for juvenile offenders who committed crimes with clear premeditation but who were still developmentally adolescent, allowing for substantial incarceration followed by intensive supervised release, rather than the binary choice between juvenile detention with release at 25 or life imprisonment without parole. This legislation, known informally as the Cooper Law, was adopted in California in 2019 and has since been used as a model for similar reforms in 7 other states. Defense attorney Martin Goldstein continued to specialize in juvenile cases after the Cooper trial, becoming one of the nation's most prominent advocates for brain-based defenses that take adolescent neurodevelopment into account. Goldstein frequently cited the Cooper case in his scholarly articles and media appearances, arguing that Logan's question about windows that wouldn't open, while clearly indicating planning, should have been interpreted within the context of an adolescent brain's limited capacity for fully understanding long-term consequences. The tragedy at Ocean View High School could have been prevented at multiple points, Goldstein maintained, and the legal system's response should have reflected the reality that a 16-year-old brain, no matter how methodical its planning appears, is fundamentally different from an adult brain in its development and capacity. The attorney established the Youth Justice Initiative at the University of San Diego Law School, which combined legal education with neuroscience research to develop more effective and developmentally appropriate responses to juvenile offending, particularly in cases where trauma had contributed to escalating behavior patterns. Through this work, Goldstein ensured that the complex questions raised by the Cooper case continued to influence legal education and practice long after the trial had concluded. The educators most directly connected to the case experienced varying trajectories in the years following the tragedy. English teacher Andrea Winters, who had overheard the foundational clue but not recognized its significance, resigned from teaching at the end of the 2013 school year, unable to reconcile herself to the role she perceived herself as having played in failing to prevent the violence. I keep thinking that if I had just asked him why he wanted to know about the windows, if I had mentioned it to someone, things might have been different, Winters told a journalist for a 5-year retrospective on the case published in the San Diego Union Tribune. School counselor Diane Rodriguez, who had been unable to provide meaningful support to Logan due to her overwhelming caseload, became an outspoken advocate for increased mental health resources in schools, testifying before the California State Legislature about the impossible expectations placed on school counselors responsible for hundreds of students. Principal Diana Mendez remained at Ocean View High School through the rebuilding process, implementing what became known as the Ocean View Model for School Safety and Inclusion, before eventually being appointed to a statewide position focusing on school climate and violence prevention. Her experience with the tragedy transformed into expertise that benefited educational institutions across California. Logan Cooper himself remained a subject of ongoing interest and debate as he began serving his life sentence, initially in a specialized unit for juvenile offenders within the adult prison system, before being transferred to general population when he turned 21 in 2017. His case continued through the appeals process, with his attorneys challenging the constitutionality of life without parole for offenders under 18, though these appeals were unsuccessful given the clear evidence of premeditation in his crime. Prison records, portions of which were obtained by journalists through Freedom of Information Act requests, described Logan as a model prisoner who pursued education through correspondence courses and worked in the prison library. Psychological evaluations conducted as part of his ongoing incarceration noted his continued emotional detachment and limited expression of remorse, though some reports suggested gradual development in his capacity for empathy as his brain matured into adulthood. Logan declined all interview requests from media and researchers interested in his case, his silence allowing him to remain somewhat enigmatic, even as his story became a case study in criminology textbooks, juvenile justice conferences, and law school curricula across the country. As the 10th anniversary of the Ocean View High School stabbings approached in 2023, San Diego had physically recovered from the tragedy but remained marked by its legacy in ways both visible and intangible. The school itself had been transformed, not just through the renovation of the cafeteria, but through a comprehensive approach to student well-being that had made it a model for other institutions facing similar challenges. The Donna and Ryan Foundation had grown into a nationally recognized organization with headquarters in a modern building overlooking San Diego Bay, its work touching thousands of schools and potentially preventing countless similar tragedies through early intervention and systematic reforms. The legal system in California had evolved, incorporating more nuanced approaches to juvenile offenders who committed serious crimes with clear premeditation, directly influenced by the Cooper case and its complex questions about adolescent development, responsibility, and appropriate consequences. And in a maximum security prison hundreds of miles from San Diego, Logan Cooper, now 26 years old and neurologically an adult, continued to serve a sentence that would span his entire life, his question about windows that wouldn't open having long since been answered by a justice system that determined his calculated violence warranted permanent confinement despite his youth at the time of his crime. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the case was its impact on how schools across America approached the daily reality of the cafeteria, transformed from an overlooked venue for social hierarchies and unchecked bullying into a recognized focal point for school climate and student well-being. The Cafeteria Connections program developed by the Donna and Ryan Foundation had been implemented in more than 2,000 schools nationwide by 2023, creating structured activities, mentorship opportunities, and adult supervision models that specifically address the dynamics of lunch periods, what had been Logan Cooper's hunting ground. And the sight of his humiliation became, in schools across the country, an opportunity for intentional community building and inclusion. Educational researchers documented significant reductions in bullying incidents and improvements in school climate metrics in institutions that adopted these reforms, suggesting that the lessons learned from the tragedy at Ocean View High School had created safer environments for countless students who would never know the names Donna Hargrove and Ryan Wilson, or understand how their deaths had catalyzed changes that made school cafeterias places of connection rather than torment. In this transformation lay perhaps the most hopeful response to a tragedy that had begun with one student's question about windows that wouldn't open and ended with a community's determination to ensure that such windows of opportunity for intervention, support, and prevention would remain forever accessible to those in need.